Sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Greet you all with the greetings of peace. Very happy to be with you all again for our fifth live discussion of this wonderful book, Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul, which is authored by Professor William Chittick, who we are very honored to have as our special guest for today. And so the way that we're going to do this session is a little bit different from other sessions. As everyone knows, we've asked people to submit their questions, and we had such actually wonderful questions. And so we've kind of collected them together, and we'll be asking Professor Chittick for about an hour in discussion about this book and the Islamic intellectual tradition and Sufi tradition more generally. And then if there's time at the end, we may open it up for broader discussion. With that, I wanted to extend a warm welcome to you, Professor Chittick, and express gratitude for your time.
Thank you.
Um, so the first question that I wanted to ask is, and I'll spare people, of course, you've done some other interviews and your biography is online, so I won't make you tell your life story, but I am curious about a passage that you shared in the book Divine Love, Islamic Literature and the Path to God. In the introduction, you mentioned that, speaking of love, it is so central to the overall ethos of the religion that if any single word could sum up Islamic spirituality, by which I mean the very heart of the Quranic message, it would surely be love. I used to think that knowledge deserved this honor and that Franz Rosenthal had it right in the title of his book, Knowledge Triumphant. But now I think that love does a better job of conveying the nature of the quest for God that lies at the tradition's heart. So I'm curious if you might expand on that topic, this between knowledge and love, and what it was that, or what in your journey through these texts shifted your perspective from the centrality of knowledge to the centrality of love.
I suppose my initial exposure to Islamic thought was, very academic, and very much through uh, presentations of Islamic theology, metaphysics, really. I mean, I was more interested, of course, in the beginning, particularly with more interest, let's say, in Ibn Arabi, who attracted me from the outset when I was an undergraduate. I heard about him, read a little bit about him, and it seemed to me that this made sense. And of course, I happened to be at this time taking a junior year abroad in the good old days when Beirut was a lovely town to visit. And AUB, the American University, is on the Mediterranean. And I went really because I read about its beach. That was about it. History major, okay, let's take some courses on Islam. And Saint Hussein Nasser happened to be there, and of course he's very much a philosopher, philosophically oriented, and it was his brilliant exposition of what Islam is all about that really attracted me, along with, and then as far as texts go, it was Ibn Arabi at the beginning, and then of course I did my, back in Ohio, I did my senior research paper on Rumi because Rumi was available. The whole Masnavi had been translated by Nicholson and other works. So, and although, and then of course I wrote once, let's see, it's a long story, of course, when I look back. Ended up in Iran to do a PhD in Persian literature and to study under Sayyid Hossein Nasser. And of course, attended all of his lectures on Sufism and philosophy, Islamic philosophy, and became engaged with a number of really outstanding philosophers over the years. And it just seemed to me, the way I was built, that Uh, it is all based on understanding, on knowledge, on when it comes down on the perception of what it means to have faith in God, his angels, his books, his prophets, the last day, the measuring out. That is the substance of the Islamic intellectual history, explicating the three principles of faith: Tawheed, prophecy, and the return to God. So this was, and this, of course, once back in the United States, when my wife and I were teaching at Stony Brook, we started lecturing on Islam. We were very dissatisfied with the various textbooks that are available. We had to write our own. The vision of Islam was the result of that, and put together, which is very much a vision based on knowledge, I can put it. But then, of course, I spent simultaneously years studying Ibn Arabi, and one thing led to another. But the basic issue that I kept on coming back to is the eternity of the divine love, the unconditionality of love, of God's love, in one respect, and the conditionality of God's love in another respect. And this, to me, is at the heart of the Islamic message, at least the conclusion I had reached by the time I was writing Divine Love. And I haven't changed my mind. And Farghani, the text I'm working on now, is very much making this extremely explicit. So there are two basic Quranic verses. You're all familiar with them, I think. The way Yuhibbuhum wa yuhibbunahu is the first one, 554. This is the text that is always quoted in the brief version like that. He loves them, they love him. This is not a command to do something, to love God. It's a statement of fact. God loves human beings eternally because God's attributes do not change. Human beings love God by nature. There's nothing else they can love. So what is the problem? Of course, the problem is ignorance. The problem is forgetfulness. The problem is they don't know what they love. The problem, they think, I love this, I love that, I love her, I love him. Well, those are simply disclosures of the divine reality. You don't really love that. And look, that's going to disappear very quickly. One of Rumi's central messages. What you love is just evanescent because what you really love is eternal. So that's one side. That's unconditional love. Those with a Christian background are, familiar with that sort of thinking. Christianity Christians generally make a big point about God's unconditional love, as if no other religion knows anything about that. The second verse is, of course, Qul, addressed to the Prophet, in tuhibbun Allah, if you love God, fattabi'uni yuhbibkum Allah. This is the heart of Islamic practice. The first verse sets down the heart of Islamic theory. It's Tawheed. There's no God but God. There's no lover but God. There's no beloved but God. There's no love but God. And therefore, human beings by nature, by their fitra, by their original nature, love God. The second verse sets down the principle of prophecy. If you love God, follow me, that is Muhammad, God will love you. Now, look at this, if you love God. Well, the fact is you do love God. If you could understand that, and here, of course, ilm and ma'rifah are very important. I don't want to degrade knowledge and say knowledge is in any way unimportant. It's the foundation, because unless you know what you love, you can't love it. You're loving an illusion. If you love God, follow me, let's follow Muhammad, and God will love you. So the whole point of Islamic practice, theory and practice, is following in the footsteps of the Prophet. Based upon what? Love. Well, this is basically the reasoning. I've written about this a lot, of course, in Divine Love and a number of articles which have appeared, which are available at my website. And of course, I'm redoing this whole thing in the introduction now to Farghani, the introduction to Ibn Farid. I'm also reviewing this, and Farghani himself provides the most thorough explanation of the way that love permeates reality that I've run across in any text that I've read. So that's the brief of it. The rest is my life. I mean, I can't, as you were saying, I can't just begin all over. Yes.
Well, we're very much looking forward to the text that you're working on, and perhaps towards the end we can hear more about that. But I wanted to ask you a bit more, since we're talking about love and knowledge. One of the books, and still a book, which now it's 40 years later. But when anyone asks me if they really want to understand Rumi, and they're an English speaker, which book should they read? I always tell them Sufi Path of Love. And he was written in 1983, which was before I was born. I was born in 1984. So, but of course, the situation of Rumi in the English-speaking world has radically changed since then. In the introduction, you mention this. You say that the Western reader faces a number of obstacles in approaching Rumi. And the first one that you mention is that each line draws from the Quran and the Hadith and the Islamic tradition, just as much as Dante draws on Christian tradition. But then you notice that at the same time, there is this universality to Rumi in the symbolism that he uses, which is from shared human experience. So he sees the most profound metaphysical teachings in a raindrop, in a ruby, in a stone, in a chickpea. And so that even, someone who's from outside of the Christian tradition is going to struggle much more to approach Dante than someone outside of the Islamic tradition in approaching Rumi. So you do mention that, which I think perhaps has something to do with the fact that Rumi has become so popular in the English-speaking world. But then you also mention another obstacle is that a thorough understanding of almost any passage in Rumi's works presupposes an acquaintance with the whole body of his teachings. In other words, that Rumi kind of drops you in the deep end. And the first line alludes to the whole range of Islamic and Sufi theory and practice. And so, there's no introduction, there's no step by step. So I just wanted to, ask, obviously you wrote this before, the popularity of Rumi in the West and the fact that he's become a household name today. So maybe if you could reflect on this like 40 years later and what you see as some of the reasons for this popularity, but then also your reflections on what may be lost in popular translations and, how we may bridge the gap so that people can encounter some of the deeper aspects of Rumi.
Yes. Of course. I mean, I've, thought about this a lot, and it's quite true. When I wrote that book, Rumi was almost unknown in the West. I mean, only Orientalists and people really interested in this Persian literature, and of course, there weren't many, knew about him, even though the whole Masnavi was available. And there's a history, of course. But in any case, and now, as you say, he's very popular. Let me just recall an anecdote. Probably about 15 years ago, I was invited to the Smithsonian Institute to give a talk on Rumi, right? I mean, that's, Washington, D.C., Smithsonian. I said, well, okay. 4 lectures over 8 hours with breaks and all that, and question and answer. So I went. I had about 100 people attending, and I think they paid for it. So they were serious. And one of the questions came up, what do you think about the translations of Coleman Barks? So I said, well, let me put it this way. As a Persian speaker, And someone familiar with Rumi, I can't read his translations because I'm familiar with the original and I get very upset. But if it were not for Coleman Barks, I would not have more than 2 people in this audience. So he is doing a great service. He's opening the door for people, and who knows, if they follow up on it, they may indeed reach someplace. So that's the way I look at it.
And I'm curious, yeah, that's a very, very interesting point. And obviously, 40 years later, like you said, Rumi is somewhat of a household name, and pop stars are naming their children Rumi and getting his, you know, popular versions tattooed on their arms. Um, Obviously, having sat with Rumi, and this is somewhat playful and hypothetical, what do you think Rumi would make of his popularity in the contemporary postmodern West?
Oh, I think we just laugh. It was very amusing. He had a great sense of humor. You would see the irony in this. All these people uh, caught up with really what he would call metaphorical love, and they think that he's speaking to them. Well, he is,
Mhm.
and maybe he isn't. So I think he would just be amused.
Would you say that obviously there are so many great scholars and Sufis and masters of the intellectual tradition and poets, but Rumi has become so much more popular than anyone else. Um, I'm curious if you might reflect on his intellectual milieu. Do you think it had something do with the fact that he lived in a more multicultural environment, or he was speaking to different types of people, or even maybe his feeling, his calling to speak beyond the scholarly milieu? Any thoughts you have on that, of why Rumi would speak so across tradition and so universally?
Uh, it, it has everything to do with the audience. Rumi Rumi's poetry can be understood, and especially in those days, could be understood by any Persian speaker. It was not necessary to be literate to understand Rumi.
Mm.
Just the language. He's speaking with imagery, which is very down to earth, everyday imagery. He's talking to everyone. I'm sure he had many disciples, maybe very advanced disciples, who didn't know how to read. They could recite the Quran enough to say their prayers, but no. So who is he speaking to? The common people, put it that way. Now, scholars who picked themselves say, Rumi. No. Again, an anecdote. This one I heard from one of my teachers, a philosopher, a great philosopher in Iran. And he told me he heard this from his teachers. So, it goes back. One day, Rumi was sitting together with Sadruddin Ghurnavi. Sadruddin Ghurnavi, of course, was contemporary, was a very close friend of of Rumi, is the foremost disciple of Ibn Arabi. How do we know Ibn Arabi? Because of Sadruddin Ghurnavi. All of our modern perception or later perception of Ibn Arabi goes through Sadruddin Ghurnavi. And his writing is even more difficult than Ibn Arabi, who's no slouch when it comes to difficulty. So Ghurnavi is an amazing, but who's he talking to? He's not talking to the common people. He's not even talking to the scholars. He's talking to the elite of the elite, the most educated, the most subtle of Islamic scholars. That's the audience for his books. He only has 8 or so compared to his teacher. This is a drop in the bucket, but they're very, very dense. Now, so Rumi and Sadruddin Ghurnavi are sitting together at the head of the room. Of course, Rumi's disciples are in this. Many of them are there. This is the Khanaqah, the Zawiya, everyone is welcome. And so the 2 sheikhs are talking together. And then one of Rumi's disciples comes forward. He raises his hand. Ya sheikh. He says, yes, yes, what is it? I have a very pressing question. May I ask it? He says, oh, yeah, of course. Come. So this disciple comes forward, asks Rumi this question. Sadruddin is observing. Rumi immediately, off the top of his head, answers the question, and the disciple realizes, eyes, oh, thank you, Sheikh. Now backs off, kissing the floor. All right. Sadruddin Gurnabi looks through Rumi and he says, oh, Nana, I don't know how you do that. The most difficult, complicated metaphysical issues. You put them in the simplest language. It is a marvel. Maulana Rumi turns to Sadruddin and says, Lana, what are you talking about? The marvel is you. You take the simplest ideas and turn them into the most complicated metaphysics. Now, this is very, very good statement of the difference between Rumi and the whole school of Ibn Arabi as it was developing. And of course, the two moved together. This teacher I'm talking about was a philosopher. He also, of course, loved Rumi. He listened to music all the time. There was, in the later tradition, there was no contradiction, but they understood very well that Rumi speaks to everyone. Doesn't matter what your religion is, that's irrelevant, because you don't have to know anything about your religion. Sadruddin Gurnabi speaks to the elite of the elite. Ibn Arabi speaks to those. This is why, of course, in Islamic history, and we were talking about this the other day, many of the sheikhs forbade their disciples from reading Ibn Arabi. But in private, they would teach Ibn Arabi to their elite disciples, because Ibn Arabi is too much. It's dangerous. If you take, anyway. So they're just two very, very different ways of approaching the tradition. They agree on, I would say, everything, but their language is extremely different.
I really love that story of Sadruddin Konya and Maulana Rumi, and it's really beautiful visiting Konya. These are still places of visitation to this day. Well, you speak about, I'm so happy that you brought in Ibn al-Arabi, because I wanted to next ask about Sufi Path of Knowledge, which is actually the first book of yours that I encountered and was to have a really deep and profound impact on the trajectory of my life. And this allows us to kind of explore more this theme that we've been exploring today in this conversation about love and knowledge, and their similarities and their differences, and how even almost one would wonder if at a certain point they're two words for the same reality. And I'd love to really explore more about your thoughts about Ibn Arabi, but I thought a beautiful place to kind of enter into this discussion, and then also a way that this also ties into the book that we've been reading, Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul, is just to read quickly the story that Ibn Arabi tells about his meeting with Ibn Rushd, and then ask you maybe to offer some reflections on that. So Ibn Arabi says, and so one fine day I went to Cordoba, to the house of Ibn Rushd. He had expressed the desire to meet me personally because he had heard of the revelations, or we would say the inspiration, that God had accorded me in the course of my spiritual retirement, and he had made no secret of his astonishment at what he had been told. For this reason, my father, who was one of his intimate friends, sent me to his house one day, pretexting some sort of errand, in reality to enable Ibn Rushd to have a talk with me. At that time, I was still a beardless youth. When I entered, the master arose from his place, received me with signal marks of friendship and consideration, and finally embraced me. Then he said, Naam, yes. And I, in turn, said, yes. His joy was great at noting that I had understood. But then, taking cognizance of what had called forth his joy, I added, La, no. Immediately Ibn Rushd winced. The color went out from his cheeks, and he seemed to doubt his own thoughts. He asked me this question: what manner of solution have you found through divine illumination and inspiration Is it identical with that which we obtain from speculative reflection? I replied, Nam wala, yes and no. Between the yes and the no, spirits take their flight from their matter, and the necks are separated from their bodies. Ibn Rushd turned pale. I saw him tremble. He murmured the ritual phrase, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There is no power or strength save God, for he had understood my illusion. So, I mean, this passage alone is so profound, and you quote it in Sufi Path of Knowledge. First, I invite you just to offer any reflections on what Rumi or what Ibn Arabi is getting at, as if that's an easy thing to summarize. But but also, as it ties into this book, I'm curious if you would offer any reflections on, does this point to a distinction between the two branches of the intellectual tradition um, that you identify, that being Sufism and Islamic philosophy? And if so, can you comment briefly on each branch and their relationship to one another?
Small questions. Where do you come up with these?
I've been sitting with your works for quite some time, so
Uh, well, I mean, the Na'amla, of course, what that recalls is this Ibn Arabi's uh, summary reducing of the Shahada, La ilaha, the negation, illallah, the affirmation, isbat, to two words, huwa, lahua, or two phrases. Who, not he. This is his formula, which he often cites for explicating the nature of things. So if we talk about anything other than God and ask yourself, what is it? The answer is huwa lahu. It is he. It is the presence of God. It is God. It is the face of God present in reality, but it is not he. It is not God. It is the thing itself. This two-sided picture of reality runs through Islamic thought. It's reflected, I think, in all of Islamic metaphysics. The big difference between what the approach of Ibn Arabi and the approach of, let's say, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, seems to be, well, again, the anecdote that comes to mind on this is the meeting of Ibn Sina and Abu Sa'id Abu Khair. We do know historically that they did meet, these two figures. So this would have been in the beginning of the 11th century. Abu Sa'id Abu Khair was this great Sufi sheikh who lived in Khorasan, near Maymana, anyway, near Tus, and where Ghazali was from, and this sort of place. Good friend of Busheiri, the great Busheiri, was one of the one of the most important texts in the history of Sufism, the Risala, the treatise of Busheiri. They were very close friends. And there's a biography, hagiography really, of Abu Sa'id, written in Persian 100 years after his death, which is a classic of Persian literature. In any case, we do know historically, because we have this from other sources, that, and I'm not sure where this particular version comes from, but I heard it years ago, again, from my teachers, and I think it's worth repeating on this occasion. Avicenna was traveling with his retinue, and since they were near Maymana, the village where Abu Sa'id was dwelling, he said, let's stop and visit the sheikh. We hear amazing things about this man. I wonder if it's true what they say. So they stopped. Avicenna, they got off, and of course they were welcomed at the Hanukkah. They're very much welcoming. And then eventually the Sheikh Abu Sa'id said to Abu Sana, come, let's talk. And the disciples of both sides, of course, both of them have larger retinues, and stay, outside, and they go into the interior rooms. And Abu Sana's disciples are waiting. When's he coming out? We have to get moving. We've got places to go. A day passes, no sign of Abu Sana. Another day passes, no sign of Abu Sana. Third day, Abu Sana comes out. All right, let's go. They mount up and they ride away. The disciples are his students are wondering, well, tell us, what about that man? He says, yeah, he is truly extraordinary. Everything I know, he sees. Everything I know, he sees. Now, back at the Hanukkah, the disciples of Abu Sa'id, I said, well, what about this philosopher, this guy who's, he's this great physician and all this, he's a master of all these sciences. What do you say about him? Well, he says, everything I see, he knows. So this is a beautiful, I think, statement of exactly what is going on in this exchange between Averroes, Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi is acknowledging that everything Ibn Rushd knows, he sees. But he's also saying, but you don't see what, you don't know what I see. I mean, there's not an equivalence, because your knowledge is not equivalent to my seeing, even though everything you know is correct, but it is not equivalent to seeing the realities that those make manifest. So this sort of, but then of course, there's this whole tension over Islamic history between knowing and seeing, the intellectual vision, aql, intelligence, and the generic word in Sufism being kashf, unveiling. And it is difficult to say, to draw a line between the two. When you look closely at what Abu Sana is saying, much of what he's saying is so much identical to what is being said by the great Sufi teachers, that that distinction between knowing and seeing is helpful for us who basically neither know nor see. It's helpful for us to understand what's going on. Sadruddin Konavi, of course, is one of the great sheikhs who brought these two sides together. He has correspondence with Nasiruddin Tusi, great, excuse me, a great astronomer, mathematician, theologian, really an amazing scholar of the 13th century, and also the foremost expositor of Avicenna of Ibn Sina in that century. So he was the man in peripatetic philosophy. Konavi opened up a correspondence with him. They exchanged some letters. And Konavi explains in his letter, the letter is in Persian, there's a text in Arabic, then Tusi responds with a letter in Persian, text in Arabic, and then there's another exchange. Konavi explains, the reason I'm opening up this correspondence is because I want to show, and I want to understand why it is that for both of us to understand that what the great muhakkikun, the realizers, see and say is the same as what the great philosophers see and say. Right? So showing the correspondence. In contrast, of course, to Kalam, because the Kalam perspective, dogmatic theology, is rather locked into tanzi, incomparability, God's transcendence, and doesn't allow for the simultaneous presence and absence of reality, which is central to theoretical Sufism, to Rumi, to poetry. And if you read Avicenna carefully, you can see it. And generally, the peripatetic position, it is also very much part of the way they look at the world, which is one reason why Avicenna, of course, wrote poetical. He has some visionary treatises, right? And then in the philosophical tradition, it's Sohrawardi, who's a contemporary of Ibn Arabi, who writes these beautiful, exquisite Persian symbolic narratives showing the correspondence between the realm of pure intelligence, which is what philosophy is trying to actualize, and the realm of visionary imagination, and showing how these two are tightly bound together. And of course, that's very much a part of what Ibn Arabi is all about, which is like why I subtitled the book, The Metaphysics of Imagination. Anyway, briefly. Again, this sort of question you could just go on forever.
Thank you so much. That's a really beautiful answer, and I'd love to kind of weave this in now with the book that we've been reading of yours, Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul. And in many ways, you have this beautiful, almost like thought experiment where you envision one of the great sages from the past, whom you call Hay ibn Yaqzan, from Ibn Tufayil's text, philosophical treatise. This great sage coming to our modern world and seeing our world through his perspectives and through his experience. And I kind of always laugh in reflecting on this because we're so used to modern contemporary Western scholarship looking at other traditions, right? That's the paradigm of that we're used to, but we're not used to thinking about a great intellectual master, a sage of the past. It's like the opposite of Orientalism, basically, is what we're talking about. And so I'm just curious, maybe in framing this book, any thoughts or any reflections you'd like to share about your intentions in writing this book, and then also more generally, any thoughts on that beautiful question that you're exploring in this book about how a sage from the past would identify the intellectual or the worldview of our time.
Well, this book, first of all, it isn't as I sat down and thought I'm going to write a book. This sort of book, which is a collection of essays, doesn't work that way. These are, I don't recall, I could go back and check, of course. I don't remember which of those essays I wrote first, and I don't remember when I wrote it, but quite a bit before the book was published. And in various occasions, I just had, the opportunity, it was usually an invitation either to give a talk or to write a paper. I wanted to think clearly about the common error I've seen, especially among scholars of an Islamic background, of misunderstanding the role of science and misunderstanding the role of ignoring the role of the intellectual tradition. I mean, this is clear, I think, and I don't know how to. The basic issue, I'm sure it's plain in my book, is that people seem to think this is so common. I remember as a student in Iran, I'm doing my PhD. Every once in a while, the first years I was there, my Persian was shaky, of course. I used to spend time listening to the radio, for example, simply to get used to the language. And I remember there was this famous preacher, Rashid, I even remember his name. Every day at noon, he would give a little sermon. Right? And so if the radio was on, I would listen to this sermon. And what really shocked me from very early on was that he kept on talking about the benefit of ilm, on and on about knowledge, the foundation of Islam is knowledge. And then he would encourage the listeners to go out and study engineering and medicine. He couldn't understand that this would not be considered knowledge. He couldn't understand that knowledge in the Islamic tradition is something else. All of this is peripheral stuff. All of this is way down, the list of what should be known, can be known, ought to be known. You have to begin with the foundational knowledge. And he never talked about this. It was always about encouraging the kids, the youngsters, to study hard at the university, not the madrasa. I'm not talking about the madrasa. The madrasas in those days were nothing. The madrasas after the revolution, they became something because then the way ahead after the revolution was to go to the madrasa, wear a turban, then you can get a job in government. Before the revolution, you had to be an engineer or a doctor to get a job in the government. So the way ahead after the revolution was through madrasa learning. Anyway, so my point, talking to people, hearing the way Muslims talk, even some very, very intelligent people, it's always been obvious to me that they've put the knowledge that is, talab al-ilm faridatan ala kulli Muslim. The search for knowledge is incumbent upon every Muslim. They interpret this to mean the university, whatever, anything, any field of modern knowledge, science in particular. Of course, the government encourages this. All the governments encourage this because science is, the road ahead. Because science, engineering, that's how you build a strong state. But the confusion. Now, one thing that no one quite seemed to understand is that what we call knowledge, what we call intellectual, what we call science, is a form of transmitted knowledge. That's the way people talk. Always people talk like this, even very, very smart people. Well, scientists now know that. Well, you don't know it. And how do you know the scientists know it? This is belief in authority figures. So modern science has taken the role of theologians and jurists. It tells us how to think. Not that people think, well, this is where truth is to be found. Well, what about religion? That's personal belief. You can believe whatever you want. What about practice of the Sharia? Yeah, sure, do that. That's good for you. It helps society. What about belief in God? Yeah, of course, believe in God. But real knowledge, you want certainty about everything, you have to study science, because science offers you certainty. Science offers you grounding. Science offers you foundation. People take it for granted that scientists speak truth. Now, this is called, of course, this taking it for granted is what, of course, many people have called scientism, belief in science, where science is playing the role of religion. But what this has meant for us 100 years and more in the Islamic world is that all the smart people have been encouraged to study knowledge, that is science, knowledge as it is understood in the West. And those who are left over, sort of the dregs, have ended up going to the madrasas because they couldn't get into the universities. I mean, this is a generalization and it's being unfair, I'm sure, but there are too many examples of this. And what the madrasa is basically the teacher following the rules. There are a few madrasas left, especially in Iran, and some of these have been revived, that deal with the intellectual sciences, that is, understanding truth, reality, understanding God first, Tawheed, understanding how things are. So this bifurcation that you see in Muslim intellectuals, people are very smart, people with university education, their worldview is rooted in modern scientific thinking. And as far as they're concerned, this is truth because science agrees. They don't quite realize that they're saying exactly what the old previous generation was saying. Well, this is what you must do because there's an ijma here. There's a consensus of the ulama that everyone has to do it this way. Therefore, you have to follow the consensus of the ulama. This is what they're talking about. There's an ijma of the scientists. They don't know it. This is not their own personal knowing. It is what they have heard. So people's lives are built on hearsay, the scientific hearsay. And they are not interested in another route to knowledge, which is based on understanding reality per se. And that goes back to the issue of Tawheed. There is nothing real but the reality, the absolute reality. Where is this explicated, this knowledge? In the intellectual tradition. The philosophers, all of them, are going after what is the heart and root of the reality of all things. They may not use the language of the Quran in expressing this, but this is, and that's one of the big distinctions with the Sufi teachers who always are rooted in the language of the Quran. But the philosophers know very well that there is nothing real but the real. And so the metaphysics of the Islamic philosophy is very profound. And when they do talk about cosmology, the nature of reality, the nature of the reality out there, it is embedded in this metaphysical vision. It's a vision of the one extending into the many, an explication of how the many can will return to the one, because the return to God is compulsory, no one gets away from it, but should voluntarily return to God through practicing the straight path while they have the chance in this life. So this is in philosophy, it's in Sufism. The strength of philosophy, I think, for modern people is precisely because it's so precise and logical, and we're trained in, at least we think we're trained in thinking clearly in university context. You wonder more and more as a teacher who's been doing this for 40 years. I wonder more and more if the students have maybe lost that message. But anyway, that's what it used to be. We're trying to teach the students how to think clearly, and the hope is that once people learn how to think clearly, there'll be a benefit to themselves, first of all, and to society as well. But I don't know if that's sufficient to what, or if you want to push me in a direction, I can.
Well, I'd love to maybe ask another question that can deepen us into this. And I think a theme of this and what you're kind of getting at also, but to take again a Quranic like frame is there's a section in the book where you talk about naming and how we name things, and this idea that the way we name things determines how we perceive them. And that seems central to the contention of this book. And so that brings out, and you bring out that the Quranic origin story of the human being It's the names that are central, that Adam is taught the names, all of them. And in this kind of origin story of our species, according to the Quran, the caste is God, the beings of light, the being of fire, and the being of clay. And the kind of acts are the blowing of the spirit into the being of clay, the teaching him of the names, and then three, the command for the other beings to prostrate to him. And that leads to the ascent and the prostration to the beings of light and the rejection by the being of fire. And of course, his famous statement, Ana khayra minhu, I am better than him. I am of fire and he is of clay. And so I feel like here we're talking about the centrality of he taught him the names, and the central kind of pivot of this story of the human being and the role of the human being in the cosmos um, is surrounding this, and he taught him the names. So I wonder if you might share some reflections on how the great masters, the great sages, philosophers, and Sufis read the meaning of this, because obviously he taught him the names, all of them, is open to interpretation as far as its meaning. So maybe you could share some of the ways that this was read.
One of my favorite versions of I don't know where I read this exactly, but so this is very much hearsay. One of the scholars way back when said, the meaning of that is that Adam was taught the names of all of the things in all of creation, in all of the language, in all of his children.
Mhm.
So now that, of course, is a very profound statement, because what I'm saying is our human nature has within it the capacity to name everything in every language. Our human nature, my human nature, has within it the capacity to learn every language, if, of course, it were if we're extended a few thousand years, and if all those other conditions of creation were not there, then of course. But you can understand there's the potentiality. I didn't have to grow up speaking English. My parents happened to be American, all right. If they've been Chinese, etc., and so on. And we all know people who speak several languages. I've had a couple of teachers who one in particular, 30 or so, and the capacity is there. But what languages are we talking about? All languages, all cultures, all scriptures, all arts, painting, calligraphy, all of this is language, expression. What is language after all but expressing what is within yourself? Adam was given the potential of expressing every possible thing. And how is that? Could that be? Because God taught him all the names. Now, included in that is the most beautiful names. The most beautiful names, of course, are the names of God, to which the Quran refers in several, I think 3 times it uses that expression, al-Asma al-Husna. We all know about the most beautiful names. Adam was created in Asan Taqwim, the most beautiful stature. Why is that? Because he formed you, the Quran says, Sawarakum wa ahsana sawarakum. He formed you and he made your forms beautiful. What does that mean? He created you in the image of the most beautiful names. The most beautiful names are God's names. So, in the Sufi tradition, school of Ibn Arabi, it's very clear that to say that God is to say that Adam is the form, surah of God, is to say that God is the ma'na, the meaning of Adam. As Shams Tabrizi said, Rumi quotes him in the Masnavi, although he refers to him as Sheikh Din, the Sheikh of the religion. Nicholson thought it was maybe Qunavi, but of course it's Shams Tabrizi, as you can see in his sayings. He says, Al-Ma'na huwa Allah. The meaning is God. Adam is the form. What is our meaning? What is our innermost center? God. We manifest God. Therefore, all names are knowable to us. God knows all things. He knows everything. We have the potential to know everything. We can never become God, of course, because God, by definition, exists, is real. We, by definition, do not exist. If we existed, if existence was part of our definition, we would have always existed. We are not realities, or rather, our reality is to be non-existent. God has given us an existence, and that's the gift that we have. The breath of the All-Merciful is embracing us, breathing into us. We're present. Each of us is unique, with the potential to go back to the root. And this is, so the greatest of the perfect human beings, this is the akmal al-kummal. It was one of the expressions that Farghani uses, akmaliyah, most perfectness, referring to the Prophet as the person who is the haqiqatul Muhammadiyah, the Muhammadan reality in its essence. The Muhammadan reality was that. It's God's knowledge of all reality. Or it's also called haqiqatul haqa'iq, the reality of realities. This is God's self-knowledge, which includes all realities. Muhammad is another name for that, al-haqiqatul Muhammadiyah. It's this that is manifest in the universe, and through his reality, manifest in the universe, all realities are embraced. And then he says, "Fattaba'uni." So follow me, and God will love you. God will love you if you follow me, embracing all realities. God will love you, embracing you with all his names. This is basically the theme of Ibn al-Farid. It doesn't come out in the translations, but it does come out very, very clearly in the commentary that Farghani wrote and the later commentaries as well. Are quite aware of this. It's really probably the most explicit explication of what exactly, if you wanted to say in Islamic terms, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh, from the Gospel of John, this Logos doctrine. If you wanted to say that in Islamic terms, this is what they're bringing out, explaining this Muhammadan reality and how it is manifest in all things, and through it all things were made.
MashaAllah. Beautiful. Now, just to kind of pick up on this, we can talk about one of the things that we get at when you're talking about this is this idea that the Islamic God is anthropomorphic because the Islamic human is theomorphic. God is understood in man's image, it is because man is created in God's image. Unless God is understood in human terms, in a certain sense, we won't be able to find a path back. And I want to kind of reflect on this because so emblematic of the modern view is this idea that, like Freud puts it, that God is this kind of projection of the ideal human qualities onto this ideal father in the sky.
Mhm.
And this is, anthropomorphism. And of course, there are many verses in the Quran and even more in the Hadith, which, indicate that God has a hand, Yadullah fawqa aydihim, Allah has a face. كل من عليها فان ويبقى وجه ربك ذو الجلال والإكرام. God has a shin, God sits on the throne, astawa al arsh, God descends in the last third of the night, right? We can go on and on. All of these things which cause some, I noticed some Muslims even actually kind of flinching and becoming uncomfortable when they think of this, because how do I square this with God's transcendence? And, when I first read the Quran, um, of course, I I come from a poetic background, so I was really moved actually by the poetic quality of the Quran. But when I first started to encounter um, texts on Islamic theology and even be in gatherings in the Muslim world where theology was being discussed, you know, I felt myself kind of unsatisfied by the what I was hearing about, okay, the hand means power, the face means essence, and I said, okay, fine, I'm not disagreeing with that necessarily, but just as a poet, if yed wasn't the better word, if qudra was better,
Yes, I didn't use it.
why didn't he use that, right? God obviously didn't make a mistake here, so why? Why? And it wasn't until, and luckily I came across your, books on Ibn Arabi, very, very early, that I was able to kind of, because I found Ibn Arabi had the most satisfying rebuttal. He actually had the rebuttal to that, which, to paraphrase, he said, "What makes you so arrogant to think that your hand is real and God's hand is a metaphor, and not that God's hand is real and you have the metaphor? 5 fingers are a metaphor. 2 eyes and 2 ears and a nose and a mouth is a metaphor for a wedge. In other words, the reference point to everything is the divine, the ultimate reality. And as long as we're trapped in thinking that this world is the reference point, we will be deluded. But once we take in fact, La ilaha illallah demands this. That is the starting point, that's the reference point. And through that, then we can actually start to perceive the true nature of things. And so I wonder maybe if you would just kind of reflect on this and Ibn Arabi in particular, and how also just the modern perceptions of, how people think of God often in these terms. And then, obviously we haven't even mentioned the beautiful chapter you have on the anthropocosmic vision. Maybe we can get to that after.
Well, I mean, you did a very nice job of just summarizing. uh, Huwa la huwa,
Mhm.
he not he. How these people were, the transcendence and immanence,
Mhm.
incomparability and similarity. How Ibn Arabi shows that they're in balance, whereas the usual Kalam perspective looks only at transcendence and forgets all about immanence, and does its best to interpret all of that away. Right hand means power. So yes, good. All of my books in Ibn Arabi, I think, address this issue. Uh, so
So maybe then we could actually get into this topic of the mythic imagination, khayal. We tend to see myth as something unreal. We say that's just a myth or that's just your imagination. But clearly, what you're pointing to is that these Sufi masters are using this word, the idea of myth or the idea of imagination, very differently, as a faculty that can perceive, symbolic or higher meanings. So how would you explain khayal, or explain this faculty to someone who has only been exposed to more contemporary uses or frames of the idea of myth and imagination?
uh, yes. Uh, well, first, of course, I will say, listen, myth is not used in uh, academics, or at least not in religious studies. Myth has never been a negative word, only in sort of modern
Right.
everyday usage. That's a myth. In other words, it's false. Myth is one of the words which has been used for saying the grand narratives which tell the story of origins. Of course, it goes back to mythos and logos in Greek, and the contrast between these two that the Greeks saw. But in any case, the Ibn Arabi, again, I think, does the best job explaining what the mystic imagination is all about. His depiction of the heart as having two eyes, I think, is probably, I mean, we all know from the Quran, the heart is the center of the human being. It's the heart, lahum qulubun la yaqiluna biha. They have hearts with which they don't intellect. They have no, all right. The heart is a seat of the intellect. The heart can become rusty, the Quran says. It can become cloudy. It can become ill. But if you have a healthy heart, then the light from above is reflected. And of course, the rusty heart refers to this imagery of the mirror of the heart, which Rumi, of course, makes extensive use of it in his poetry, especially in that story of taking a gift to Joseph, right? Where the only worthy gift for Joseph, who's the most beautiful person in the world, is a mirror, right? And then he turns to the reader and he says, you don't have anything you can offer to God. You have nothing. Everything you have is from God. The only thing you have you can show to God is a mirror. That is, polish your heart, polish your heart, polish your heart. So it takes it back to clarifying the heart. So this is Rumi's very straightforward explanation of how the heart is the center, that which our saving grace, the saving reality within us that we have to work on. In Ibn Arabi's depiction of the heart, he makes much use of the fact that the heart is constantly beating. This takallub al-qalb, qalb, of course, means one of the meanings is fluctuate, to change. Takallub means to undergo fluctuation and also to beat. And he points out that the heart, the healthy heart, has two eyes. One is the eye of intelligence, aql, and with the eye of intelligence, the heart knows that God is incomparable, God is beyond, God is totally other. There's no possible way of knowing God. So the knowledge of the intellect, the healthy intellect, is that God is unknowable. The imagination, the healthy imagination, is the other eye. Khayal is the other eye of the heart. And imagination, when it is cleansed and perfected, sees that everything in the world is an image, a khayal of God. Khayal means both imagination, internal faculty, and khayal means internal. We are all looking at khayals right now, khayals of each other, and khayals of ourselves. This is in classical Arabic. A khayal is a mirror image, among other things. So you just mentioned the verse, wherever you look, there's the face of God. The healthy khayal sees that, recognizes God in everything it looks upon. Whereas the healthy intellect knows that this is not God. So the khayal sees huwa, and intellect sees la huwa, he, not he. The beating of the heart indicates the healthy balance between transcendence and immanence. Falling into one excessive reliance on imagination leads to idolatry, if you like, divinizing the external realm. Excessive reliance on intelligence leads to kalam, especially in its modern forms, where God is so far above you have to reinterpret the Quran to mean nothing like what it says.
Mm.
How do you establish the balance? So Ibn Arabi is all about establishing the balance between imagination, which sees God as omnipresent, and intellect, which sees God as totally other. Both perceptions are correct, but you can't have them simultaneously, because that would mean that we were one like God is one, but we're not one like God is one. And that's why there's the new creation, right, at every moment. al-khalq al-jadid, at every moment. The self-disclosure, la takrar fi tajalli, at every moment the self-disclosure of God is new. At every moment the heart beats, and at each beat it sees God differently. The perfected heart, with each beat, sees God as present and absent, present and absent, present, and and so it goes. So with each moment, life is renewed, presence with God is renewed, understanding of God is renewed, everything is renewed ad infinitum.
Beautifully, beautiful. Now there's quite a few questions, but I want to also honor your time and not take too much more time. So I'll try to summarize a few questions here that are along these lines. Um, you know, there's that famous story that I've heard it attributed to Fakhruddin Razi, that he rode into town and the whole village came out and said, "This great scholars here." And of course, that was a time where the intellectuals were really honored. They were the superstars. A little different in our time, but um, that an old woman happened to pass, and she's like, "What's all the hoopla about?" And they said, "Don't you know this is Fakhruddin Razi, the one who has 100 proofs for God?" And she just looked and kind of scoffed and said, "That means he has 100 doubts." Um, and
Lovely,
then
yes, good.
and then of course Fakhruddin was told this, and he said, "Bring me to her so I can ask dua for her." And then of course repeated the prophetic prayer, "May we have the religion of old women." And to tie that into an anecdote that you mentioned in the book, that I think you mentioned that you heard from Said Hussein Nasser, that the day that a Muslim, a boy from a village goes to the Western school and learns that water is H2O, is the day that he disbelieves in the religion of his grandmother, right? For whom water is life and purification and this great symbol of another world. So I guess what I'm getting at here is that in a previous age, uh, most believers were probably quite simple in the sense that they hadn't read these great texts of the Islamic tradition, but yet there were great unlettered saints and great masters who didn't speak languages and hadn't even read books or couldn't even recognize their own name if it was written on a tablet. But and this is kind of where the question comes, is it seems that it's harder and harder to just be a simple believer in our age because we live in such a different intellectual milieu and we're exposed to so many different ideas that almost it becomes necessary to dive deeper for those that have the capacity, just based on the type of schooling and cultural influences that we have. So I guess I'm just open to any reflections you have on this topic.
Oh, I think I reached this conclusion when I was in college. Yes, which is why, and I realized that uh, I was being pulled in a certain direction, and I'm able to express ideas fairly clearly, and there's a great need for this. And people, simple religiosity won't work anymore, and
Mm,
you can just see it. This is yes, exactly. The nowadays, if you want to have more than a superficial belief, which once you hear that water is H2O, or once you hear that it's only your genes, or whatever they tell you now, all of these reductionist explanations of what of the way things are. We're just computer programs, all these theories of what makes us uh, makes us what we are. You need you can't just hide in a bubble. In the old days, you could go off and maybe you lived in a mountain village someplace, but nowadays you can't. None of you can escape your cell phone. It's all there. The world is there for you, and it's entrancing. So how does one escape that? I think the only possible way is to get your head on straight, and demands learning, and learning real ilm, not what passes for knowledge in the modern schools and universities or YouTube. Uh, you have to dedicate yourself to learning by yourself. One of the reasons I avoid these kinds of events that you've invited me to, and it was only because of your connections that I accepted, is precisely because I think if people are not serious enough to pick up a book, listening to someone speak off the top of his head is not going to be much help, because after all, they'll just switch to the next channel. The next hour there's someone else talking, and that will nullify. There's a great book I read years ago. You may be familiar with Four Arguments for the Elimination of Television. You aware of that book? It's a really good book, but of course, television has now been eliminated by the internet. But all of the arguments about the addictive nature and the way that uh, visual imagery flattens the world, so that Donald Duck and President Biden, well, I didn't want to make that a great politician, let's say, that Netanyahu, they're all on the same level of reality, and people aren't able to discern it. This is one of his profound arguments in that book. It's much more applicable, that book, to the video culture that we live in today, and I try to avoid it. If you're serious about these things, you've got to do more reading. And I think one thing that where you'll find my books helpful is I try not to speak for myself. I'm basically a translator. Interpretation, in order to translate, you have to do some interpretation. But I'm basically a translator. I'm trying to get these remarkable texts available in a modern format where we can read them, understand them, where they can speak to us. One of the things I don't do as a teacher, I remember early on, the surprise some of my colleagues, I never tell the students to read the Quran. I think that's a waste of time when you don't know. If you're reading in English, unless you're a very gifted person, maybe with a poetic temperament, you're not going to see anything there. Because you have no idea what the worldview of the Quran is. The Quran was speaking to a world where everyone thought the same way. That worldview has been lost. Same is true of the Bible and the Upanishads and the Tao Te Ching, for that matter. The worldview is gone. So what I've always been trying to do, let's say beginning with Rumi, the Sufi path of life, is offer you the worldview so you can see the big picture where they're standing, and then you can see the logic of this sort of rhetoric in the Quran, this sort of mythic imagination, which is both intellectual, and very imaginative and expressive, which speaks to you on all levels of your being. The worldview that within which these people operated is largely a dead letter nowadays, because of the fact that our education from where does it begin? It begins with various videos when we're two, maybe, is all grounded in various scientific views of the world. And therefore, it's extremely difficult to break out of that. And I think that's one of my intentions. One of the things I was hoping for with Science of the Cosmos, the book, was to give people a way of beginning to break out of the grip of the scientific worldview, which just holds us from failing to see what is going on in Rumi, for example, or in, much less Ibn Arabi.
I think that's a beautiful place to kind of transition. A number of people ask questions around for those of us raised and educated in the West, what is the best way to fully imbibe and adopt a traditional Islamic way of thinking? And another question related, do you have any advice for young junior academics trying to establish themselves in a domain that dismisses the traditional worldview and epistemology and has a very limited view on what authoritative knowledge is. Another question was around which of your books you would recommend for people after they've read this. And it's safe to say that the people in this course are deeply wanting to embody this tradition and wanting to transform their souls to be prepared for drawing near to Allah. So, any remarks in that regard, I think,
Yeah.
would be.
Well, the academic, to the person involved in academics, the first thing you have to do is get tenure. Then you can talk. Before you get tenure, you just have to follow the rules. And you have to be very, very circumspect, very, very careful about what you say. Because if you step on toes, then of course you'll be outside of academia, which has its advantages perhaps, but if you want to remain within academia, you have to follow the rules until you get tenure. Once you have tenure, then you can open up a bit and tell people what you really think. So that's, but for those who this is, it's a question of a personal quest. Well, this is what I'm saying, that all of my books are really were written as aids for people on their personal quest. If you a Vision of Islam, if you haven't read our Vision of Islam, which I wrote with my wife, I'm really amazed. I mean, I've been teaching this book for 30 years. Students who come in, many of them really have a strong background in Islamic learning, especially coming from Pakistan. They know nothing about their own religion. It's really very sad. The way religion is taught as rote learning, and they know the words, but they don't know what the words mean. The Vision of Islam, I think, is very helpful, uh, because really we wrote that book after we'd been studying Ibn Arabi for years, and it's an attempt to bring together the various sides of the Islamic tradition, but also explaining how important it is to get the whole religion established, not just the external parts of it. And part of that, of course, is developing your own understanding. Another book which I think is really helpful, especially if you have some background and if you're poetically minded, Repose of the Spirits. I don't know if any of you have looked at that. I mean, it's a great big heavy book, right? It's ostensibly it's a commentary on the divine names, written by an author an unknown author. After this, inshallah, he'll be known, but who died, I think, in 1140, right? So he's a contemporary of Al-Ghazali. And the book is in Persian. The translation, just the translation without the apparatus, intro and notes, is 500 pages. It's a long book, ostensibly a commentary on the divine names. So he runs through the 99 names, but it's not about the divine names. The names are just an excuse to open up the reader to all dimensions and totally integrated vision of Islam as both practice, understanding, and spirituality. It's an amazing book. It is much, much more readable than Al-Ghazali, for example. I love Al-Ghazali. I've read a lot of Al-Ghazali, and I noticed that a lot of people are really, really into Al-Ghazali these days, and encouraging young Muslims to read Al-Ghazali. Ghazali is very dry compared to Samani, the author of this book. Ghazali, he's not a poet, for example, although he cites poetry on occasion, but he doesn't have that poetical sense that Samani is. It's a prose book, but it might as well have been written in poetry. It is so imagistic, and it is so profound. There are many, many ideas in that book, which I thought Ibn Arabi was the first person to clarify. But he died 25 years before Ibn Arabi was born. And where is he living? In Marv. Marv is in Central Asia. It's in Turkmenistan. Or no, it's Uzbekistan now. Right? Of course, Marv in those days was right near Mashhad and Tus. These were all the central intellectual area of Khorasan. It's an amazing book. It's very, very full. You might find it difficult going, but don't try to digest it all at once. But that's a remarkable compendium of all that is beautiful in Islamic teaching.
It's a beautiful book, and we actually have a course on the 99 names where that's 99 days. We take a different name a day, and that was one of the texts that we used as for the course as well.
Yes, but you notice that many of those texts, it would take you a month just to read what he says about that one name. I mean, read it carefully, not just
Yeah. And you're right.
first paragraph.
He seems to almost like cite the name and then go in a totally different direction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's just a pretext. The names are a pretext to open up the reader's hearts to the beauty of God. This is what the book is about.
I
If he had
wanted
been a
to,
poet, he would have been Rumi.
right, right.
I mean, this is the book, the prose book, the only prose book I know in Islamic literature which prefigures Rumi, right? Which is Rumi speaking in prose, and 100 years before Rumi, right? It's an amazing text.
So, I think we'd be remiss not to mention this one question. What are the practices that one of the great sages would recommend for us to cultivate a vaster awareness and more illuminated intellect so that we can perceive things through the light of God? And another question related and puts it this way: are there any high yield practices you could recommend, especially for an older participant in this course who certainly hasn't and won't be able to put in the sheer time and dedication of the practitioners of the intellectual tradition due to age, ongoing time at work, and not being from a scholarly background?
It very much depends upon, your who you are and what you are drawn to. Uh, I think the practices that certainly to develop the intellectual side of oneself, one has to do some serious reading, or at least get familiar with. I wouldn't take it too seriously. I mean, I think it's enough to expose oneself. Al-Ghazali is a good place. Ibn Arabi, Rumi, all of these great teachers. As far as practice goes, after the basics of the Sharia, I think if you don't have a Sufi sheikh yet, you better get one, because that's where nowadays there are just too many options, and you can't just pick and choose. That's not the way to do it. That's the ego talking. The whole path is about giving up the ego, giving up the nafs, and my own freedom to choose. Well, this is a high yield practice. If I do this, I'll reach enlightenment much quicker. Whatever. Forget about enlightenment. Forget about reaching anything whatsoever. Think only about God. Keep God in mind. It's His job to take care of you. It's not your job to take care. Your job is to do what He asks you to do. Right. So you have to focus on what you know you must do. And that, if you don't know what you must do, well, maybe you better go back to the Quran and the basic teachings of the religion to figure them out.
Well, there's obviously so many more questions we'd love to ask, but we want to honor your time. You've been very generous, and hopefully, we can follow up with you with sharing some of the conversations and discourses that come out of this course. Again, I know I speak on behalf of all of the participants in this course in saying that we're really grateful for you honoring us with your time. And I know that we'd all love to be in person, just sitting and being able to be in an open dialogue. So I didn't have to speak on behalf of everyone, but I know also the medium of Zoom and the limited time meant that we wanted to bring everyone's question together. So thank you so much for sharing and for really all of your work. It's deeply informed us and everything that we're doing, and we look forward to the work that you're working on now. Maybe if you wanted to just say a word about what you're working on now, since we mentioned that at the beginning, for people to look forward to, and then we'll close.
Well, basically, I'm translating Ibn Farid, the famous Qasida, the Nazr Suluk. translated as versification of the Wayfaring. It has three translators. One partial translation by Nicholson, the great Orientalist who did Rumi, of course, masterly edited and translated that. One complete translation by A.J. Arbery, whose translation of the Quran is very good, but whose translation of the Qasida is problematic. And another translation by Homerin in the Classics of Western Spirituality. All the translations are pretty bad when you come right down to it. And because they're just not paying attention to the way that Qasida, 760 verses, first of all. We're not talking about, 10-verse Qasida. 760 verses is huge. That Qasida is so deeply embedded in the Sufi tradition. And although they acknowledge this fact, the translators, they don't make any use of it in their translations, really. So the way it looks like that will be published with a short introduction, the short introduction and the text with the facing translation. For those of you who know Arabic, because if you look at, it's been my experience when I look at these translations, most translations of poetry are like this, Islamic poetry. If you put the Arabic next to the English, you can't figure out how the translator got from that Arabic to this English. They tend to be very loose, and poets get carried away by their own genius and ignore the genius of it. And then maybe their Arabic is not quite good enough either. In any case, my translation is about as literal as it's possible to make it. And I'm being faithful to the use of technical terminology, because Ibn al-Faris is smack in the middle of the Sufi tradition. It goes straight back to al-Qushayri and Khaja Abdullah Ansari and all these other great early teachers. So that's one thing. But that's a book of maybe 100 pages. It'll appear, at least if I have my way, there'll be no notes to it. In other words, if you want to know what he's talking about, because when you read the English or the Arabic, it makes no difference. Read the Arabic, you have really not much idea what he's saying. You read the English, same way. And you're getting something. You need a commentary. Well, the best commentary, the earliest commentary, first of all, was written by Saiduddin Farghani, who died in the year 1300 approximately. Farghani was a direct student of Sadruddin Qanavi. Qanavi was, as you know, the major spokesman for Ibn Arabi. Qanavi lectured on this poem over a period of years. Farghani took notes, wrote up the whole, he lectured in Persian on this Arabic poem. Farghani took notes in Persian, presented once he had finished it, gave a clean copy to Qanavi. Qanavi approved of it, so this was published. Then Farghani went to Cairo. This would have been in Anatolia, Konya, Damascus maybe. Farghani went to Cairo. He was teaching in Cairo. He wrote a second commentary, some of it more or less the same as the Persian, but in Arabic, much longer, with a very long introduction, 150 pages, dense introduction. And then, so the whole thing is 800 pages, right? Right now, my translation is 800 pages, single-spaced. We're talking about a big book. It is an amazing presentation of Islamic metaphysics, cosmology, everything. Path to God. He wrote in the introduction, 150 pages or so. Abdurrahman Jami, writing a few centuries later, said, this introduction is the very best presentation of ilm al-haqiqah to be found in the literature, the knowledge of the reality. He means, of course, that this whole school of Ibn Arabi and Qanavi and this whole 13th century amazing proliferation of philosophical Sufism. The difference between, let's say, Farghani's writing, and especially the prologue, well, no, all of his writing, but the prologue specifically, and let's say Ibn Arabi, Qunavi is not that Farghani is clearer, it's that he's systematic. He develops the ideas point by point by point. He develops them all in a very, very clear way with a very, very clear goal. And so you get really an organized presentation of this whole worldview, this sophisticated worldview, which then becomes the basis for Sufi theorizing in the later centuries. All of these things that people say about Ibn Arabi in later centuries, it all goes back mainly to Farghani, well, to Qunabi and other disciples of Qunabi as well. But Farghani, I think, is probably the most influential of all of these immediate or second generation followers of Ibn Arabi. And he's very original. It's not that he's quoting Ibn Arabi. It's not that he's rewriting Ibn Arabi. He's this is realization. It's verification. He's digested it all and is giving it forth in a new, fresh way. Yes, it's reminiscent of, the terminology is reminiscent of what we read before, but now he's defining terms. It's an amazing book anyway. So, and as you can see, I'm very enthusiastic about it, but I doubt if it'll be published at best, maybe 2 years. That would be early, maybe 3 years down the line. Inshallah, I'll live that long and, remain strong enough to finish it. There's a lot left. Even if the translation, I've done 5 drafts of the translation, but it still needs work. And the introduction, I'm working on the second, third draft of the introduction, and then the notes, and then, of course, publication of a big book. Going through the press, it'll take a press probably a year to, even accept the book for publication. So it's a big process.
Well, may Allah inspire and extend your life and give you the strength
Barakallah
and,
feek.
and bless it. And we look forward to having you back to discuss that book once we read that together.
Inshallah.
Well, again, thank you for your time, and I know that I speak on behalf of everyone in this course, and I see in the chat there's a lot of people extending their gratitude. So thank you so much, and yeah, we look forward to continuing to benefit from your work.
Barakallah feek.
All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing everyone else next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.